Imagine a low, vibrating hum that begins to be felt throughout the body even before the sound reaches the organs of hearing. This is not just the noise of engines. It is a symphony of hundreds of heavy engines tearing through the morning silence over the boundless fields of Ukraine. On June 2, 1944, residents of the Poltava, Mirgorod, and Piryatyn areas witnessed a spectacle that seemed absolutely impossible in the realities of that time. Huge, silver machines gleaming in the sun with white stars on their wings began to descend over Soviet airfields. These were flying fortresses, the legendary American B-17 bombers, which had flown across all of Europe to land here, in the very heart of the Soviet rear. At this moment, history made a sharp turn, uniting two ideologies, two armies, and thousands of people who, just yesterday, considered each other representatives of completely different worlds. Operation Frantic began, becoming one of the most ambitious, technically complex, and at the same time tragic episodes of Allied cooperation in World War II. The air over Poltava was permeated with the smell of high-octane gasoline and a premonition of something grand. To understand how these giants ended up here, one must look at the map of Europe during that period. The Third Reich was gradually shrinking, but its industrial centers in Eastern Germany, Poland, and Hungary remained out of reach for American aviation based in Great Britain or Italy. The bombers simply lacked the fuel to reach their targets and return. The solution seemed audacious and logical at the same time. Organize shuttle missions. Aircraft would take off from bases in England or Italy, strike targets deep within enemy territory, and instead of turning back under anti-aircraft fire, would continue east, landing at prepared Soviet airfields. There they would refuel, replenish ammunition, and attack the enemy again on their return journey. The idea belonged to American General Arnold, and after long diplomatic maneuvers initiated at the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Joseph Stalin gave his final consent. The path to realizing this plan was paved not only with diplomatic protocols, but also with titanic engineering work. Soviet airfields in the Poltava region, after liberation from occupation, presented a sad sight. Runways were cratered, buildings reduced to ruins, and the area mined. Preparation for receiving the American giants required the transfer of colossal amounts of cargo across oceans and continents. As part of Operation Frantic, trains carrying equipment flowed from the United States via Iran and Murmansk. The most important and complex element of preparation was the delivery and laying of Marston mat, known as PSP, or perforated steel plates. This was a technical marvel of its time. Steel sheets 3 meters long and 40 centimeters wide, perforated to reduce weight and drain water, were interlocked with special fasteners, creating a durable surface capable of supporting a 30-ton bomber. More than 45,000 such steel sheets were delivered to Poltava. Thousands of people worked on their installation. Soviet military builders, engineering units of the American Army, and the local population. It was grueling work in the open air. Women from nearby villages, whose husbands and sons were at the front, hauled heavy slabs alongside soldiers, slabs that became so hot in the sun they burned hands even through thick mittens. The clang of interlocking steel locks merged into an incessant rhythmic noise that did not subside day or night. The laying of the 2-kilometer strip in Poltava became a symbol of collective effort. American Sergeant Bill Turner wrote in his diary that he had never seen such dedication. These Russian women work as if the end of the war tomorrow depends on each slab laid. They smile at us, although their lives seem unbearably hard, and treat us to bread, which they themselves, it seems, eat only on holidays. In parallel with the strips, infrastructure was being erected, the scale of which was astonishing. Dozens of fuel tanks with a total volume of several million liters were installed. The Americans brought not only aviation gasoline with an octane rating of 100, which was in short supply in the Soviet Union, but also complex filtration and pumping systems. The maintenance of flying fortresses required sterile cleanliness of the units, which seemed almost impossible in the conditions of Ukrainian field airfields. But a solution was found. Mobile workshops were deployed, equipped with diagnostic equipment that Soviet technicians could only dream of before. All this gigantic mechanism had to work like clockwork by the summer of 1944. When the first group of American specialists and service personnel fully settled in at the base on June 1st, a sense of a strange, hybrid world emerged. In Poltava's canteens, alongside familiar porridges, appeared Spam, canned meat, instant coffee in tin cans, and dry rations with chewing gum. Soviet officers curiously examined American magazines, albeit under the supervision of political instructors. The culture shock was mutual. Americans were amazed by the harshness of everyday life and iron discipline, while Soviet people were struck by the ease with which American pilots communicated with their command. It was a collision of two planets, temporarily brought closer by the gravity of a common task. On June 2, 1944, the operation entered an active phase. A group of 73 B-17 bombers, escorted by 64 P-51 Mustang fighters, took off from bases in southern Italy. Their target was the railway junctions in Debrecen, Hungary. After striking, the Armada did not turn back, but headed northeast. The flight across the front line was a dangerous moment. Soviet anti-aircraft defense crews had been warned, but the risk of accidental engagement remained high. Navigation was carried out using radio beacons installed by the Americans on Soviet territory, which in itself was an unprecedented level of trust in matters of secrecy. The technical aspect of the flight itself represented the pinnacle of aviation art of those years. Each B-17 carried 4 powerful Wright Cyclone engines, each with 1,200 horsepower. The 10-person crew was in unpressurized cabins at an altitude of 7,000 to 8,000 meters, where the temperature dropped to -40 degrees. The pilots used oxygen masks and electrically heated suits. Any breakdown in such a system over enemy territory meant the end of the crew's life journey. That is why the opportunity to land in Poltava was a lifeline for them. When the silvery giants appeared over the landing lights, silence reigned on the ground. The first to touch the steel "1" strip was the plane of General Ira Eaker, commander of the 18th U.S. Air Force. The rumble of the landing gear on the steel plates sounded like a triumphant chord. Personal meetings on the airfield after landing were emotional. Lieutenant John Miller, pilot of one of the bombers, recalled, "Soviet mechanics surrounded the planes, reverently touching the fuselage. For them, the B-17 was not just a machine, but an embodiment of the industrial might of an ally." A period of intensive work began, when refueling and preparation for the next sortie took only a few hours. However, behind the facade of this brotherhood in arms lay deep ideological and systemic contradictions. This was the first layer of conflict, visible, but only the tip of the iceberg. The Soviet leadership, despite agreeing to the operation, harbored enormous suspicion. Every action of the Americans was recorded by state security officers. The territory of the bases was divided into zones, and free movement of American servicemen outside the airfields was practically excluded. Moscow's fears were twofold. On the one hand, fear of espionage; on the other, an unwillingness for Soviet citizens to see the standard of living and technical equipment of a capitalist country. The Americans, accustomed to freedom of maneuver, felt uncomfortable under strict control, which led to minor but frequent clashes at the administrative level. The second layer of conflict was personal, internal. Young men from Ohio, New York, and California faced the reality of total war of attrition waged by the Soviet Union. In the diaries of American gunner Robert Greene, there is an entry. "Everything is different here. These people have nothing but the will to win. We complain about the lack of hot coffee, and they sleep in dugouts and work 20 hours a day. Sometimes I think we are playing at war, and they are living it." This realization of the difference in the scale of suffering and effort created a psychological barrier. Soviet people, in turn, saw Americans as some kind of celestials who flew in on their shining machines to help, but remained alien, incomprehensible. Football games between teams of pilots and technicians became rare moments of sincerity when the rules of the game replaced political directives. The third layer, the ideological conflict, concerned the very essence of warfare. American strategy was based on the concept of high precision, for that time, daylight bombings using secret Norden bomb sites. These bomb sites were so valuable that they were forbidden to be left in planes overnight, let alone shown to Soviet specialists. This infuriated the Soviet command. "If we are allies, why are you hiding your technology from us?" Soviet strategy, on the other hand, was aimed at direct support of ground forces, and shuttle missions seemed to Moscow to be an unnecessarily complex and not always effective tool. The clash of two military schools, two approaches to the value of technology and human resources, created a constant backdrop for Operation Frantic. Despite these frictions, June 1944 was a time of outstanding success. Shuttle missions struck airfields in Romania, oil refineries, and transportation hubs. The German command was disoriented. Their air defense systems were configured to repel attacks from the west and south, but certainly not from the east. The element of surprise worked flawlessly. However, the Luftwaffe was not going to tolerate the appearance of American bases in its rear. Nazi intelligence began a large-scale hunt for the shuttles, and the opportunity arose very soon. The situation transformed on the night of June 21st to 22nd, 1944. Ironically, it was the third anniversary of Germany's attack on the Soviet Union. During the day, American planes struck targets in the vicinity of Berlin and landed in Poltava. This time, a German Heinkel 177 reconnaissance aircraft was able to stealthily follow the American group at high altitude, pinpointing the exact location of all aircraft on the airfield. The Soviet side, confident in Poltava's deep rear position, did not provide adequate air cover with night fighters and did not have enough radar stations. At midnight, the first German target designators appeared over the airfield. They dropped flares that turned night into a bright, frightening day. Following them, the power of 80 Heinkel 111 and Junkers 88 bombers descended on Poltava. It was one of the most accurate and destructive Luftwaffe operations of the entire war. German pilots saw American flying fortresses lined up in neat rows on Marston steel mats as if on parade. A firestorm began. High explosive and incendiary bombs turned the planes into piles of burning metal. The steel sheets of the covering warped from the heat, turning into a trap for those who tried to save the equipment. On this night, heroism and tragedy were inextricably intertwined. Soviet soldiers and American pilots together rushed to the burning machines, trying to pull them away from each other so that the flames would not spread to the entire parking area. Under a hail of shrapnel, They fought for every plane. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Petrov, one of the airfield technicians, later recalled, "We didn't think about safety. We saw the labor of thousands of people dying, how the machines that were supposed to bring the end to the enemy were burning. We grabbed ropes, hooked them to tractors, and all the while shells continued to fall from above. That night we were one team, without separation by language or rank." Unfortunately, the lack of coordination in air defense systems led to German bombers mercilessly pounding the airfield for almost 2 hours with impunity. The result of the raid was catastrophic. 47 flying fortresses were completely destroyed, and another 29 sustained heavy damage. Huge stockpiles of aviation fuel and ammunition were annihilated. But the most severe blow was the loss of personnel, both Soviet and American servicemen, who remained at their posts until the very end. This moment became the culmination of the entire Operation Frantic. Shocked Americans demanded the immediate deployment of their own night fighters and anti-aircraft crews to guard the bases. The Soviet leadership perceived this as an insult and an encroachment on sovereignty. The trust, which was already fragile, crumbled along with the burnt aircraft. After the tragedy in Poltava, the operation continued for several more months, but its spirit was broken. Several more shuttle missions were carried out, including from Italy, but the scale was no longer the same. The political situation in Europe was rapidly changing. Soviet troops crossed the state border and began the liberation of Poland. The question of who would control the liberated territories became increasingly acute. The Warsaw Uprising in August 1944 became a stumbling block. The Americans wanted to use the Poltava bases to supply the Polish rebels with weapons and provisions, but Stalin imposed an absolute ban on this. This decision became the final signal for the curtailment of the project. In September 1944, the last American planes took to the skies over Poltava, never to return. The farewell was dry and formal. Equipment that could not be evacuated was handed over to the Soviet side. The vast fields of Marston perforated steel remained on Ukrainian soil, gradually covered in dust and rust. Operation Frantic officially concluded, leaving behind only mountains of ash where the planes had burned and thousands of pages of secret reports in the archives of both countries. The resonance of these events is felt even 80 years later. Operation Frantic remains a unique example of how technical perfection and a common goal can temporarily erase boundaries between even the most irreconcilable enemies. The lessons of Poltava teach us that alliance is not only about common enemies, but also about common values, without which any structure proves unstable in the face of crisis. It was a great experiment that showed the limits of what was possible in international cooperation. We see how important it is to be able to listen to and hear a partner, even if their methods seem strange and their goals suspicious. The tragedy of June 22, 1944, at the airfield was a bitter lesson that underestimating the enemy and a lack of trust within a coalition led to catastrophic consequences. Today, the significance of this page of history extends beyond purely military achievements. It reminds us of the human dimension of grand politics, of those very women who laid the steel plates, of the pilots who shared chocolate, and of the mechanics who fought the fire side by side. In these simple acts of interaction lay the seed of a different future, which, unfortunately, did not sprout in the conditions of the soon-to-follow Cold War. But the very fact that it was possible gives us food for thought in the modern world. We understand that even in the darkest times, There are moments of light when people are capable of rising above their fears for a great goal. Concluding this narrative, we return to that very airstrip in Poltava. If one were to walk through those places today, one would find only rare fragments of that very perforated steel which local residents used for decades in their households, for fences, or strengthening sheds. Marston steel, once serving as support for powerful B-17s, became part of everyday life, dissolving into peaceful existence. This cyclical return to the Earth symbolizes the outcome of any military endeavor. Ultimately, only memory and the lessons we learn remain. Operation Frantic began with the triumphant hum of engines and ended with the silence of the fields. But this silence is filled with deep meaning. Looking at the sky today, we understand that security and peace depend not only on the power of flying fortresses, but also on the strength of those invisible threads that connect people of different cultures and beliefs. The history of the operation near Poltava is not just a story of bombings and tactics. It is a parable about trust, its cost, and the consequences of its absence. May the silvery gleam of American planes over Ukrainian fields remain in our memory, as a reminder that even the boldest dreams of unity require courage, honesty, and a readiness to see in another person, first and foremost, a human being. This lesson remains relevant for us today, as the world once again seeks ways to overcome the barriers that divide it.